Could you tell me about the history of Aboriginal peoples in Australia?
No.
Hi, my name is Audrey Senior, and I am a student at Stanford University in California. This summer, I spent 3 weeks studying history and culture in Australia, specifically focusing on the experiences of Aboriginal peoples, the Indigenous people of Australia, and the Torres Strait Islands. Through reading scholarly works, going to museums, and watching films, I realized the nuanced nature of the issues I was studying. But more than that, I realized I was lacking the perspective of everyday Australians, and this was something I wanted to change. I went around Sydney, interviewing strangers on the street. I wanted their perspectives on the topics I had learned about. Here's what they said. Could you tell me about the history of Aboriginal peoples in Australia?
Oh my goodness. No, it's simply too broad.
Could you tell me about the history of Aboriginal peoples in Australia?
I don't know too much about it. I know it's terrible. And they were treated like absolute garbage.
I guess they're the sort of first and founding cultures in Australia, like the first peoples here.
I believe they're the oldest people on the planet.
Well, I wasn't here when they first came.
40,000 years, I think.
40 or 50.
Here a long time.
I'm still counting.
Indigenous Australians have been probably on the Australian landmass from between 70,000 and perhaps as far back as 250,000 years ago.
To these days, it's pretty accepted that we've been here for at least 60,000 years, but we were always taught that we've always been here.
They would have come down out of Africa through the subcontinent and down through an Indonesian land bridge.
Through a join between Australia and basically like Papua New Guinea.
They've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Some people live on the coast, some people live in the mountains, some people live in the desert. So we live all across Australia. At the time prior to colonisation, there was estimated to be at least 2 million Aboriginal people.
They had very established cultures and communities and established languages as well.
I think there was something more than 250 different areas or countries in Australia, all with their unique cultures and unique languages and rituals and that kind of stuff. And they were just like many other kind of nomadic cultures in the sense that they were nomadic and they lived off the land, within their country areas. If they were going to step out of their country lines, they would have to negotiate with fellow tribes. Just like many other cultures, there was battles and wars and relations of various kinds.
All I've really learnt in the history books is when the Australia was colonised, and then pretty much Aboriginal culture was partly destroyed.
And then Captain Cook discovered it in 1770.
I mean, up until 1788, when colonisation was specifically started as a historic event.
And then the first fleet came down in 1788 with Irish convicts.
Aboriginal people living here a long time ago, and the European people come here and they fight.
Yeah, they said something like there was a empty land, but actually no, they have like Aboriginal living here.
Because Aboriginal people, they don't live in one places. They will move. It depends on I believe in the weather. When the weather is changed, they will move from one place to another place, and that's why I think the white people named Australia land as a colonialist, the land that belonged to no one.
Well, they're the outright landowners. They stand land, so we're just invaders. I think.
Colonisation happened, bloodbath. We stand on blooded ground as a culture, and all that jazz.
I have friends whose grandparents have oral histories about poisoning waterholes and chasing Aboriginal people on horseback and making them jump off cliffs.
They have a stolen generation where white people used to take away Aboriginal children away from their family members so they can change their skin color to become white, and they can follow the white culture by becoming Christian. So they were there was an adoption places for all Aboriginal children. They're not allowed to live with their parents, and even with the Aboriginal people back then, they were not allowed to marry the same Aboriginal people. They have to marry white people to change their skin color.
And there was a white Australia policy.
if I could change it, I'd change it, but I can't. So I can't. You know.
Yeah, so I'm Māori. I'm from New Zealand, and yeah, we're still fighting for our land, and we just finished coming back from Aboriginal Land Council and had a conference learning about the history. I know that New Zealand and Aboriginal have similar experiences, you know, being colonised by the British, and I feel that Aboriginal have a long way to catch up, but hopefully they do, and like I respect the Aboriginal, I respect the land, I respect their culture.
I think a lot of Indigenous communities are still going really strongly, and language groups are strong, and cultures are strong, and there's still a lot of vigour in terms of Indigenous communities in Australia.
What do you think is the current state of racism and xenophobia in Australia?
I think it's pretty dire. I think Australia tends to be a very racist country.
It is the current state is it's bad.
No, people being ignorant of the kind of the fallout and the the consequences of history on Indigenous people.
I grew up in a country town that was 40 kilometres from the nearest high school. So we used to have to get a bus to high school. The bus used to drive past the Aboriginal children and not pick them up, and because they lived on the outskirts of town, so they would have to walk several kilometres to school because our bus wouldn't pick them up.
Aboriginals have been part of the
We're a very multicultural society in Australia.
There is a lot of support for Aboriginal people, and I mean over history, many of the things that we've been able to achieve have also been with the support of many different communities and many different nationalities.
I just know that, you know, they just want their land back, really, and you know, I still think there's a lot of racial profiling against them, and they're still being treated less than, you know, they should be equal to every other person despite the colour that they are.
I think Australia doesn't really do very well in terms of engaging with Indigenous people and sort of constructively, I suppose, making sure that we close the gap between Indigenous Australians and the general population. And there aren't very genuine steps to closing that gap.
So in terms of things like the closing the gap issue, it's a massive issue. It might not be solved. As part of some personal work that I've done with Indigenous communities and working with some of the people who have been involved, that kind of stuff, a few people's estimates is that it's probably going to take about 100 years from now, more or less, into the future for the gap, so to speak, to close. And it's going to be extremely difficult to make that happen faster through subsidizing of different programs. I mean, we have a few different programs. Yes, we can do better, etc. But the circumstances themselves and the history is just so grim that we don't have adequate answers. Because if we did have adequate answers, we'd see more progress.
You know, politicians don't do anything about it.
Politically, Australia is really racist, and we have people who are pretty openly xenophobic.
Look, I think Australia has always been a very racist country, and we've changed our targets.
For example, our immigration policy is pretty blatantly racist.
After World War II, a lot of Australians became very racist, probably just against anyone who came into the country. And then I think that has continued to happen with each new wave of immigrants.
We are both from Brazil, and I'm not living in Brazil right now. I moved to Taiwan. She feeling like worried about our nationality, like Asians.
I'm not racist though. I don't. You know, we're all human. We're all. You know, we're all put on this earth, but I don't discriminate about anyone. You know, I don't.
We all love everybody.
Yes.
It
You'd have to
doesn't
be a
exist.
racist and a xenophobe. But, Australia's always been a multicultural society. By the very fact that I'm
I just don't
Irish
believe in
English
same-sex
couple.
marriage.
Sobre racismo aqui na Austrália.
Okay. For me, it's a little bit when I'm went to Mardi Gras. A lot of men drank. He said, "This is my friend." I say, "No." And what do you do in my country? Come back to your country. Yeah, very rude.
Xenophobia and racism is
the only thing that
that
hasn't worked is some communities won't learn English and they won't assimilate, and they just don't believe in Australia.
Yeah, racism, it's not as, I wouldn't say it's not as bad, I'd say it's more underlying in the way we speak and stuff.
Recently it's improved a lot, I'd say. I haven't really had any more notice much of it at all, especially since I've moved to Sydney.
I experienced racism within the past 7 years, maybe 2 to 3 times. It's not as much as before.
I don't think we've lost all hope. I think there are some, really inspiring pockets of Australia where people are still really good and positive.
So everyone is respect one another, they welcome one another, and I can see the love of Australian towards asylum seekers and refugees.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of people from Africa now. I've got a taxi driver that's from Ghana, and they want to be part of Australia. If you talk to them individually, they want to look for the future and have a future for their kids and their families. They don't go around killing people.
Probably the good thing about the way the politics are is at least you know where the racists are, and they've got big voices.
Australia's a wonderful country.
Quite separate.
And we love Trump too.
Do you have any idea what the current state of racism and xenophobia is in Australia?
Not really.
What advice would you give Americans and the American government on issues of racism and xenophobia?
America.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, jeez.
The new president doesn't like foreigner people, and for me it's very, very bad.
I think it's a very dangerous path to go down, any form of racism or xenophobia, because once it becomes ingrained in a culture, it's very difficult to remove it.
Not to spread racism around the communities, because that is the beginning to start the World War III. By being racist towards asylum seekers, refugees, or other religion, it's not appropriate. In my opinion, everyone has the right to have their own religion, to follow their own culture.
One of the approaches of our business is Indigenous knowledge being part of environmental consciousness, and that Indigenous peoples of the world are the ones who've looked after the land for the longest, and I think if we're going to save the planet, that wisdom of tens of thousands of years needs to be listened to. And when you think about gas pipelines going through country over there, and I think listening more to that knowledge of the land, of people in that country for a lot longer.
Just keep fighting racism, stop it out.
Everyone should be equal. No point in profiling people because of the colour of their skin. It's just ridiculous.
Making sure that you listen to what I suppose marginalised, racialised groups are saying and what they want.
I think the culture of heritage is not only you cannot be judged by your race or what you feel.
First of all, just get educated. Because you're much more likely to fall into those behaviours which are categorised by others as racism or xenophobia if you bring your culture with you to a situation which you are ignorant of. And that's not, that's any culture going into any other culture, this is hopefully a more worldly statement than specifically America. But get educated, try and leave your assumptions at the door, or at the airport, so to speak. Come with an open mind and recognise that, and this is its own more personal statement, but recognise that you are out of the American bubble. Things are very different in the world than in America. So leave your culture at the door and just come with an open mind and prepare to be educated.
Get your shit together.
Get your shit together. You know what I mean? It's not hard to adapt to cultural, other people's culture. It's not hard, and you don't got to make it look so difficult. Just, find that respect in yourself and dignity, and just look after those around you. Yeah.